tutorial, we're going to be implementing a method for fading out the foliage when the camera gets in too close. Now you're probably asking, why would I want to do that? Real foliage doesn't do that. And our motivation for doing this is purely for gameplay. If you're in a third-person game and you have dense foliage, the player might lose track of where their character is, or they might not be able to see enemies or other important gameplay elements because of the foliage density. So what we're going to do today is implement a material function that allows us to fade out the foliage when the camera gets too close in. So the first thing that we're going to do is come down here to our materials, and I'm going to create a new material function. And we're going to call this camera distance mask tutorial. And let's open up this function and start building. Alright, so what we need to do is find the position of the pixel and compare it to the position of the camera. So I'm going to add a world position and also a camera position. And we need to find the distance between these two. And so I'm just going to add a distance node, nice and easy. And so the closer we are to the camera, the darker we want this mask to be. Now I'm going to put in a little bit of extra flexibility and allow us to move the point where it becomes completely dark forward just a little bit. So I need an input here. And I'm going to call this input near far, and it's going to be a vector 2. And so this is going to contain two values, the point where I want my mask to start, which is the near value, and the point where I want it to end, which is the far value. And I'm just going to give it some default values here. We're using Unreal's units, which are in centimeters. And I want this effect to start happening 2 meters in front of the camera, so I'm going to give it a value of 200. And then I want it to stop about 6 meters away from the camera, so I'm going to give it a value of 600 there. Alright, the next thing that I need to do is take my distance value, and I need to subtract my near value from it. So I'm going to create a component mask, and just mask out the red channel here. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to make another one for the green channel as well. Now I'm going to take the red channel and I'm going to subtract it from my distance value. And I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm just going to subtract my near value from my far value. And then I'm going to divide the result of my first subtract by the result of my second subtract. And let's take a look in our little preview window here and see what kind of result we're going to get from this. Alright, so you can see that when this sphere is close to the camera, it's black. And then as it moves away, it becomes white. And this is the effect that I'm looking for. So I can use this distance or camera distance mask to multiply by my opacity so that when I'm near the camera, I'm multiplying by a black value. And as I move away, I start multiplying by a white value. So from 0 to 2 meters, my opacity will be completely black. And then as I move away, it will slowly fade in and become white or 100% opaque. So this is the mask that I want to use. So now I can take this material function and add it to my shader. Before I add the material function to my shader, I do want to give you a little tour of what I've done here because I've cleaned up this shader quite a bit since last week's tutorial. You can see that I've isolated groups of nodes and labeled them with what they do. So here is the bit that does the wiggling of the leaves. And here is the bit that does the normals. You can see that I'm blending between the camera vector and the vertex normal based on my leaf mask. So the leaves are using vertex normals and the branches are using camera vector normals. I'm also computing the face normals here so that I can fade them out at glancing angles. And down here is the ambient occlusion that we created last week. And then I have a few little items here: the translucent color, the opacity, wiggle normals, and leaf mask. So you can see that I've done a bit to clean things up and put in some comments so it's a little bit more obvious what's going on. Okay, so let's take our distance mask function and plop it into our shader. And all we need to do with our function is multiply it by our opacity. So I'm going to take our opacity here and multiply it by the camera distance mask that we just created. And then I'll pass the result of this into the opacity mask, and I'll save it, and let's take a look at our result. Alright, so here we have our tree, and as we zoom in, you can see that the branches slowly cut away so that they don't get too close to the camera. And this does look pretty good. However, I will note that it is kind of artifacty because the camera kind of slices through and you can see the edges of the planes. It would be nice if there was a way that we could fade these out instead of just slicing them out. And in order to do this, we need to use a node called DitherTemporalAA. So the DitherTemporalAA node basically converts my grayscale opacity value into a dithered pattern, and then it syncs up with the temporal anti-aliasing to make that dithered pattern appear like it's transparency. We're not using real transparency here, but we're faking it with a dither pattern combined or synced up with the temporal anti-aliasing that the game is doing. So this node is pretty easy to use. I can just pass my opacity into the alpha threshold pin, and then I can pass the results of this into my opacity mask. And let's take a look at our result. Alright, so as we zoom into our tree, you can see that instead of being chopped off or cut out, the foliage actually fades away. And it's doing that with that dither pattern that I talked about. So you can see kind of a noisy dither pattern, and the foliage just kind of fades out. So this is happening because the dither pattern that's applied is synced up with the temporal anti-aliasing, and we get a nice fade without actually having to pay the extra cost that it would cost to use real transparency. So this is a really nice effect. And you can see that it also applies that dither pattern to the foliage fading out at glancing angles. So the foliage kind of fades out instead of actually, instead of clipping out. So this is a really nice method of achieving a fade out effect without actually having to pay the cost of transparency. Now I want to switch back to our shader, and I have one last thing to say before we end up today. There are a lot of features going on in this foliage shader, and normally you don't want to do all of these things at once. I'm talking about a whole bunch of different techniques. We have our face normals, we have our wiggling leaves, we have our ambient occlusion, we have two different kinds of normals, one for the leaves and one for the branches. And now we're also adding a camera effect that makes our foliage fade out when you get too close. There's a lot of features going in here. And normally, because foliage is alpha tested, there's a lot of overdraw. And so you try to make foliage texture or foliage materials as cheap as you can. Like I said, I've got a lot of features here, and you may, when you're making your foliage material, you may want to pick and choose which of these techniques you're actually using so that your foliage material doesn't get too expensive. Alright, well that's it for today's tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. Next week we're going to take a look at a method for varying the color of our trees depending on where they're placed in the world. If I were to take this tree and make 100 copies of it and they all looked exactly the same, that might not be that realistic. And so we're going to add a feature to the foliage shader that changes the color of each individual tree just slightly so that there's a really nice broad range of colors. Stick around for that one. If you like the tutorial, give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to see more tutorials like this. And we'll see you next week, everybody.